March 1967. A U.S. Army convoy vanishes 3 miles off its designated route. 14 crates of M16 rifles. Gone. 8 cases of Claymore mines. Vanished. 400 pounds of C4 explosive. Disappeared without a trace. The guards swore the men who stopped them wore Allied uniforms, spoke perfect English, showed legitimate paperwork. But here's what the Pentagon never wanted you to know. Those men weren't Viet Cong. They weren't Soviet operatives. They weren't enemy infiltrators. They were Australians, our closest allies. And they had just pulled off the first strike in what would become the largest theft operation in coalition military history. You think you know the Vietnam War? You think you know who fought beside American soldiers in that jungle? Think again, because what I'm about to reveal has been buried in classified files for over 50 years. 2 governments agreed this story must never reach the public. Veterans were threatened with losing their pensions if they spoke. Investigators were told to close their files and walk away. Millions of dollars in American weapons, intelligence equipment, even top-secret NSA encryption devices, all of it systematically hijacked by the very allies America trusted with its secrets. Why did they do it? How did they get away with it for 6 years? And what happened when the Pentagon finally discovered the truth? Stay with me until the end. Because by the time this video is over, everything you thought you knew about Allied loyalty in Vietnam will be shattered. This is the story they tried to erase. Let's begin. The American sergeant found the convoy 3 miles off its designated route, stripped clean like a carcass in the desert. 14 crates of M16 rifles, gone. 8 cases of Claymore mines, vanished into the jungle. 400 pounds of C4 plastic explosive, disappeared as if they had never existed. The guards stood in a confused circle, pointing toward the tree line, insisting that the men who stopped them wore Allied uniforms and spoke perfect English with a strange clipped accent. The date was March 15, 1967. And the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam had just stumbled upon a scandal they would spend the next 6 years desperately trying to bury. But this was merely the first thread in a web of betrayal that stretched far deeper than anyone imagined. The Australians were stealing American weapons. Not occasionally, not accidentally. Systematically, brazenly, and with an efficiency that would have impressed the Viet Cong themselves. This was not a few soldiers pocketing souvenirs. This was an organized operation run by the most elite Special Forces unit in the Southern Hemisphere. A shadow procurement network that would eventually divert millions of dollars worth of American military hardware into unauthorized hands. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had arrived in Vietnam with equipment their own government refused to provide. They had decided to solve that problem themselves. What followed was one of the most audacious and carefully buried scandals of the entire war. A story of Allied betrayal, institutional corruption, and a rivalry so toxic that both governments agreed it must never reach the public. And what the Pentagon discovered next would make the missing rifles look like pocket change. The roots of the Great Weapons Heist stretched back to 1962, when the first Australian military advisors arrived in South Vietnam to discover they had been sent to fight a modern war with obsolete equipment. The standard issue Owen submachine gun dated from World War II. The radios weighed 40 pounds and failed in humidity. The boots fell apart after 3 patrols in jungle conditions. Canberra had committed Australian lives to American strategic objectives while refusing to commit Australian dollars to keeping those lives properly equipped. The soldiers adapted. They always adapted. But adaptation in 1962 meant trading with American counterparts, bartering captured enemy weapons, and writing increasingly desperate letters home, describing conditions that the newspapers were forbidden to print. But desperation has a way of breeding innovation, and the innovation that emerged would shock 2 governments. Then came 1966, and everything changed. The first Australian task force established its base at Nui Dat in Puoc Tui province, and suddenly the scale of operations required equipment that no amount of informal trading could provide. The SAS squadrons needed specialized demolition gear for their deep penetration missions. The infantry battalions needed reliable automatic weapons that could match the AK-47 in close jungle combat. Canberra's response was bureaucratic silence. Requisitions disappeared into the Defense Ministry's filing system. Urgent requests were downgraded to routine. A single replacement radio could take 8 months to arrive, by which time the soldiers who needed it had either improvised or come home in boxes. The Americans, meanwhile, were drowning in surplus. The logistics pipeline that fed 500,000 U.S. troops generated waste on an almost incomprehensible scale. Equipment was lost, abandoned, written off, and replaced without anyone tracking where the original items had gone. Someone in the Australian command structure looked at this disparity and made a decision that would never appear in any official document. The Yanks had too much. The diggers had too little. The solution was obvious, if technically criminal. What happened next would become the blueprint for the largest Allied theft operation in military history. The first organized diversion occurred in April of 1966, and it established the template for everything that followed. A routine American supply convoy traveling from Long Binh to a fire base near the Cambodian border was stopped at what appeared to be a legitimate military checkpoint. The guards wore proper uniforms. The paperwork looked authentic. The sergeant in charge spoke with the flat vowels of the American Midwest, though something about his phrasing seemed slightly off. The convoy commander later reported that the checkpoint personnel conducted a security inspection, lasting approximately 45 minutes. They examined cargo manifests, checked vehicle identification numbers, and asked detailed questions about the route and destination. They were professional, they were thorough, and they were completely fictional. When the convoy reached its actual destination, an inventory revealed that 19 M60 machine guns had been replaced with wooden crates filled with sandbags. The weight matched. The seals appeared unbroken. Someone had practiced this operation extensively before attempting it in the field. But this was just a rehearsal for something far more ambitious. Military police launched an investigation that went nowhere. The checkpoint had vanished. The guards had vanished. The weapons had vanished into the vast, unknowable jungle, and no one could explain how 19 heavy machine guns could disappear from a guarded convoy without a single shot being fired. The answer, of course, was that no one had needed to fire. The Australians had simply asked nicely, shown the right credentials, and driven away with enough firepower to equip an entire infantry company. The Americans never connected this incident to their allies. Why would they? The Australian task force operated in a different province. Australian soldiers had no access to American supply routes. The very idea that Commonwealth troops would steal from their partners in a shared war seemed absurd. This assumption would prove remarkably convenient for the thieves, and their next operation would make 19 machine guns look like a warm-up exercise. The system evolved rapidly during the second half of 1966, developing layers of sophistication that revealed careful planning at command level. Simple checkpoint diversions gave way to more elaborate schemes involving forged requisition orders, compromised American supply clerks, and a network of Vietnamese intermediaries who could move equipment without attracting attention. The key innovation was what internal documents later called the Ghost Unit Protocol. Australian intelligence officers created fictional American units on paper, complete with commanding officers, personnel rosters, and supply requirements. These phantom formations existed only in the procurement system, but their requisitions were very real. Equipment ordered for non-existent units was delivered to legitimate American depots, where it was then transferred to Australian custody through a chain of paperwork so convoluted that auditors spent years trying to untangle it. But the audacity of the ghost units was nothing compared to what came next. One such ghost unit, designated the 47th Special Operations Detachment, officially requisitioned over $200,000 worth of equipment between August 1966 and February 1967. The unit never existed. Its commanding officer was a name borrowed from an American who had fallen in action 3 months earlier. Its supply sergeant was a fictional character based on a popular television program. Yet the equipment it ordered was delivered, receipted, and promptly disappeared into Australian hands. The audacity was breathtaking. The Australians were not merely stealing weapons. They were exploiting the chaos of American logistics to create an entirely parallel supply system, one that operated within the official structure while serving completely unauthorized purposes. And the Americans never suspected their closest allies. Not yet. The men who ran this operation understood that success depended on 2 factors: American disorganization and Australian silence. The first was guaranteed by the sheer scale of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The second required a conspiracy of loyalty, that extended from the lowest private to the highest command levels. No Australian soldier ever informed on the scheme. Not one. This fact alone reveals how thoroughly the regular troops supported what their special forces colleagues were doing. But loyalty alone could not explain the scale of what was happening. Something darker was at work. The weapons stolen from American convoys ended up in Australian hands, and Australian soldiers who carried those weapons into combat knew exactly where they had come from. They used them anyway. They used them proudly. And they kept their mouths shut with a discipline that the official army could never have commanded. The culture of silence was reinforced by a simple logic that every soldier understood. The Australian government had failed its fighting men. The Americans had more than they needed. Taking from the Yanks was not theft, but redistribution, a correction of an injustice that Canberra was too cowardly or too cheap to address through legitimate channels. This logic conveniently ignored several important facts. The weapons belonged to another nation's military. Diverting them violated international law, military regulations, and the basic trust that coalition warfare requires. But in the jungle, such concerns seemed abstract. The only thing that mattered was whether your weapon fired when you needed it. And the M16 rifles taken from American convoys fired very reliably indeed. The moral calculations would come later, if they came at all. The scale of the operation expanded dramatically in 1967, driven by Australia's deepening commitment to the war and the SAS regiment's increasingly ambitious mission profile. Deep penetration patrols required specialized equipment that the Australian supply system simply could not provide. Silenced weapons, advanced demolition charges, long-range communication gear, night vision devices that were still classified in American inventories. All of these appeared in Australian hands through channels that official records could not explain. But the July operation would cross a line that even the thieves had hesitated to approach. One particularly audacious operation in July of that year targeted an American Special Forces compound near Pleiku. The Australians did not steal from this facility directly. Instead, they cultivated a relationship with a supply sergeant whose gambling debts had become unmanageable. In exchange for clearing those debts, the sergeant arranged for certain items to be _4_ and redirected to a collection point accessible to Australian personnel. The arrangement lasted 11 months and diverted an estimated $340,000 worth of specialized equipment before the sergeant's rotation back to the United States ended the relationship. He was never charged with any crime. No investigation ever connected the losses to Australian involvement. The file was simply closed with a notation that inventory discrepancies had been attributed to combat losses and administrative error. This phrase became a running joke among Australian Special Forces veterans. Combat losses and administrative error covered everything from missing rifles to vanished vehicles to an entire pallet of medical supplies that somehow ended up in an Australian field hospital without any record of how it got there. The Americans were losing a war against an enemy they could see. They never realized they were also losing a logistics battle against allies they trusted completely. But trust, once broken, has a way of surfacing in unexpected places. The most controversial aspect of the Australian procurement network involved not weapons but intelligence equipment. Material so sensitive that its diversion could have triggered a major diplomatic crisis had the full extent become known. The National Security Agency maintained listening posts throughout South Vietnam, gathering signals intelligence that contributed to the broader American war effort. These facilities contained encryption devices, code-breaking equipment, and communication intercept gear that represented the cutting edge of 1960s surveillance technology. Australian intelligence officers wanted access to this equipment. Their government's requests through official channels had been repeatedly denied. What they did next would remain classified for over 40 years. American counterparts cited security concerns and compartmentalization requirements that excluded even close allies from certain technical capabilities. The refusals were polite, but absolute. Australia would not receive American intelligence equipment through legitimate means. So they took it through illegitimate means instead. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Australian signals personnel were occasionally attached to American units for training and liaison purposes. During these attachments, they conducted careful reconnaissance of equipment layouts, security procedures, and vulnerability windows. They identified items that could be removed without immediate detection. They cultivated relationships with American technicians who might be persuaded to look the other way at critical moments. The actual thefts occurred during periods of maximum confusion, typically combat alerts or base evacuations that created natural opportunities for equipment to go missing. And the November operation would become the most daring intelligence heist of the entire war. A single operation in November 1967 removed 3 encryption devices from an NSA facility outside Saigon during a rocket attack that sent personnel scrambling for bunkers. By the time the all-clear sounded, the equipment had already begun its journey to Australian custody. The intelligence value of these acquisitions was enormous. The Australians gained access to American code-breaking capabilities that their own government could never have developed independently. They could read communications that Washington had tried to keep secret from its allies. They had achieved through theft what they could never have achieved through diplomacy. But this success came with terrible risks that would not become apparent for years. The first serious investigation began in February of 1968, triggered not by American suspicions, but by Australian carelessness. A soldier returning home on leave was stopped by customs officials in Sydney, and his personal effects contained items that raised immediate questions. Among his souvenirs was a component from an American radio system that was still classified, equipment that no Australian soldier should have possessed under any circumstances. What the investigators found next would threaten to unravel the entire operation. The investigation that followed was initially narrow, focused on determining how one individual had obtained prohibited material. But interviews with the soldiers' unit members revealed a pattern of equipment acquisition that made no sense within the official supply system. Soldiers described weapons and gear that Australian units had never been issued. They spoke casually about yank surplus that seemed to appear whenever needed. They showed no awareness that what they were describing constituted systematic theft from an allied nation. The investigators faced a dilemma that would shape everything that followed. A thorough inquiry would expose the scope of Australian procurement activities and potentially destroy the relationship with the United States at a moment when Australia desperately needed American support. A limited inquiry would fail to address what appeared to be an institutional failure of staggering proportions. A cover-up would make everyone involved complicit in ongoing criminal activity. They chose the cover-up. But secrets this big have a way of demanding exposure. The decision was made at levels far above the investigators themselves, in meetings that were never officially recorded, and decisions that were never formally documented. The soldier caught at customs was quietly discharged for medical reasons. The investigation was closed with findings so heavily redacted that the remaining text conveyed no meaningful information. And a message was passed through back channels to American counterparts that certain supply discrepancies need not be pursued too aggressively. The Americans, dealing with their own problems in a year that would include the Tet Offensive and over 16,000 combat fatalities, were happy to let the matter drop. But the truth had a way of surfacing anyway, and when it did, both governments would scramble to contain the damage. The pressure on the procurement network intensified dramatically after Tet, when Australian operations expanded to fill gaps left by American forces redeploying to crisis areas. The SAS conducted more patrols, the infantry engaged in more combat, and the demand for equipment outstripped anything the shadow supply system had previously handled. What had begun as targeted diversions to address specific shortages became a general effort to keep Australian units operational, despite their government's continued failure to provide adequate support. The statistics from this period would later prove devastating to both armies' official narratives. Between February and August of 1968, Australian units reported equipment losses that exceeded their official inventory by nearly 40%. This was mathematically impossible unless equipment was being added to the inventory through unofficial channels and then written off as combat losses to conceal its origin. The paperwork created a perfect circle of deception. Material arriving without documentation and departing through documented losses, leaving no trace of the theft that made the entire cycle possible. American logistics officers began to notice patterns they could not explain. Certain supply routes showed consistent shortages that did not correlate with combat activity. Certain depots experienced losses that exceeded statistical probability. Certain Australian units seemed remarkably well equipped for forces whose government was notoriously stingy with military funding. Questions were asked. Memoranda were written. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, suspicions began to crystallize into something more dangerous. The Australians had been stealing for 2 years. Their luck was about to run out, and what happened in October would force both governments into a decision they had desperately hoped to avoid. The confrontation came in October of 1968. Though calling it a confrontation overstates the drama of what was actually a carefully managed exercise in mutual embarrassment. American intelligence had compiled a file on Australian procurement irregularities that was sufficiently detailed to support serious allegations, but sufficiently circumstantial to allow for alternative explanations. The choice of whether to escalate or accommodate lay with commanders who had no interest in a public scandal during an election year. But the evidence on the table left little room for diplomatic fiction. The meeting occurred at MACV headquarters in Saigon, and no official record of it exists. What we know comes from participants who spoke decades later, breaking silences they had maintained through careers and into retirement. According to these accounts, American officers presented evidence of diversion activities spanning 2 years and involving equipment valued at several $1,000,000. They did not accuse the Australians directly. They simply laid out the facts and waited for a response. The Australian response was a masterpiece of diplomatic deflection. Yes, there had been irregularities. Yes, some equipment had moved through unauthorized channels. But the responsibility lay with individual soldiers acting without command authorization, a few bad apples exploiting wartime confusion for personal gain. The institutional involvement that the evidence clearly suggested was dismissed as misinterpretation. The pattern that the Americans had documented was explained away as coincidence. Both sides understood that these explanations were nonsense. Both sides also understood that pursuing the truth would damage interests that mattered more than accountability. What emerged from that room would shape Allied relations for decades. The Americans needed Australian political support for a war that was becoming increasingly unpopular. The Australians needed American military support for operations that their own government would not adequately fund. Exposing the theft ring would serve neither nation's interests. A deal was struck, though no one called it that. The Americans would close their investigation. The Australians would restrict unauthorized procurement activities. Both governments would ensure that documentation of the scandal remained classified for the foreseeable future. The theft would continue, of course. It would simply become more careful. The final phase of the Australian procurement network operated from late 1968 until the withdrawal of the last Australian combat forces in 1972. During this period, the methods became more sophisticated, the targets more selective, and the paper trail even harder to follow. The amateurs had been purged. What remained was a professional operation that understood exactly how much it could take without triggering the tripwires that American investigators had installed. But the most valuable acquisitions during this period were not weapons at all. Australian intelligence officers focused their efforts on obtaining classified documents, technical manuals, and operational procedures that would prove useful long after the war ended. They copied files. They photographed equipment. They debriefed American personnel with a thoroughness that exceeded any legitimate training requirement. One Australian intelligence officer later described this period as the _8_. His unit obtained detailed specifications for weapon systems that would not enter Australian service for another decade. They acquired communication equipment that formed the foundation for Australian signals intelligence capabilities well into the 1980s. They built relationships with American defense contractors that would prove profitable for years after the shooting stopped. The war was ending. But the lessons learned from stealing American equipment would serve Australia for generations, and the final accounting would reveal a scandal far larger than anyone had imagined. The financial accounting of the entire operation has never been officially completed, though researchers working from partial records have attempted estimates that range from $20 million to over $50 million in 1960s currency. Adjusted for inflation, this represents hundreds of millions in modern terms, a transfer of military capability from the United States to Australia that occurred entirely outside official channels and without compensation of any kind. The human cost is harder to calculate. American soldiers who should have had certain equipment went without, because that equipment had been diverted to Australian hands. Supply shortages that were attributed to enemy action or logistical failure were actually the result of Allied theft. How many Americans suffered because the gear they needed was sitting in an Australian armory will never be known. But the Australians had their own calculations to make. The Australians would argue, and did argue when confronted decades later, that they were addressing a failure of their own government rather than attacking American interests. The equipment they took saved Australian lives. Their government's refusal to provide adequate supplies created the conditions that made theft necessary. Blaming the soldiers who solved the problem was easier than blaming the politicians who created it. This argument has merit, but it does not excuse what happened. Coalition warfare depends on trust. The Australians violated that trust systematically and deliberately, exploiting American generosity and American chaos to build capabilities they could not legitimately obtain. They did so while maintaining a facade of Allied cooperation that concealed the reality of what was actually occurring. The betrayal was real, even if the motivations were understandable. The aftermath of the scandal, such as it was, unfolded over decades rather than months. Classification requirements kept the most damaging documents sealed until the 1990s, by which time most participants had retired or passed on. Journalists who attempted to investigate the story found sources unwilling to speak and archives frustratingly incomplete. The full picture emerged only through the patient work of historians, who pieced together fragments from multiple countries over years of research. But even the partial truth that emerged was enough to rewrite military history. The Australian government has never officially acknowledged the procurement network's existence. Defense Ministry responses to Freedom of Information requests have consistently cited national security exemptions and diplomatic sensitivities. Veterans who speak publicly about their participation risk losing security clearances and pension benefits. The wall of silence that protected the operation during the war continues to protect it today. American officials have been only slightly more forthcoming. The Department of Defense released partial files in 2008 that confirmed some of the diversion activities, though with redactions so extensive that crucial details remained hidden. The State Department has acknowledged that "9" occurred, but has declined to characterize them as theft or to assign institutional responsibility. The formal position remains that individual misconduct, not systematic Allied betrayal, explains the missing equipment. This position is maintained despite evidence that would embarrass both governments if fully disclosed. The truth is too damaging to admit, too well documented to deny, and too old to matter to anyone except historians and the increasingly few veterans who remember what actually happened. But those veterans are finally beginning to talk. The legacy of the Australian procurement scandal extends far beyond the specific equipment that changed hands. It established precedents and created expectations that shaped coalition relationships for decades afterward. American forces learned to watch their allies more carefully. Australian forces learned that their government would abandon them when politically convenient. Both armies learned that the bonds of shared combat could coexist with systematic betrayal. These lessons would echo through every coalition conflict that followed. These lessons influenced how both nations approached subsequent conflicts. American supply security tightened dramatically after Vietnam, with tracking systems and accountability measures that made casual diversion far more difficult. Australian procurement improved marginally as the embarrassment of the war's equipment failures became impossible to ignore. The shadow network that soldiers had created to survive was no longer necessary, though the mindset that created it persisted in institutional memory. Veterans of the Australian SAS speak of this period with a mixture of pride and unease. They are proud of the ingenuity that kept their units operational despite official neglect. They are uneasy about the methods that ingenuity required. Many have never told their families the full truth about where their weapons came from. Many will take those secrets to their graves. But some secrets refuse to stay buried. The Americans who served alongside them often express something closer to anger. They trusted their allies. They shared bases, intelligence, and blood with soldiers they believed were partners in a common cause. Learning that those partners were simultaneously stealing their equipment feels like a betrayal that time has not diminished. Both reactions are valid. Both capture something true about what happened in Vietnam, and both explain why this story remained buried for so long. The question that haunts any examination of the Australian procurement network is whether it was justified. The equipment that was stolen unquestionably saved Australian lives. The government that should have provided that equipment unquestionably failed its soldiers. The Americans, who were victimized unquestionably, had resources to spare in a logistics system defined by excess and waste. Does need justify theft? Does government failure excuse individual criminality? Does the fog of war create moral permissions that peacetime ethics would never allow? These questions have no satisfying answers. And perhaps that is exactly why this story was buried for so long. The Australians who ran the procurement network believed they were doing what was necessary. The Americans who lost equipment believed they were being robbed by allies. Both sides were correct. Both sides remain correct. The contradiction cannot be resolved through argument because it reflects a genuine moral complexity that refuses simple judgments. What can be said with certainty is that the scandal revealed truths about coalition warfare that official narratives prefer to hide. Allies compete as well as cooperate. National interests diverge even in shared conflicts. The bonds forged in combat can coexist with behaviors that would be unforgivable in peacetime contexts. The Australian procurement network was theft, betrayal, survival, and adaptation all at once. It was a crime and a necessity. It was shameful and ingenious. It was everything that war makes possible when normal rules collapse and men must find their own ways to stay alive. The files remain classified. The witnesses are passing away one by one. And the weapons that Australian soldiers carried into the jungle, weapons that bore American serial numbers and American ownership marks, have long since rusted into history. But the questions they raise will outlive everyone who remembers the answers. The convoys still rolled through Vietnam's red dust roads in the final years of the war, carrying supplies to bases that were already preparing for withdrawal. American soldiers still guarded cargoes they assumed were safe from everyone except the enemy. And somewhere in the jungle, Australian eyes still watched, calculating, patient, waiting. The greatest theft in coalition military history was never solved, never punished, and never officially admitted. It succeeded so completely that its very existence remains controversial, dismissed by some as conspiracy theory, and acknowledged by others only in whispers and classified documents. But the equipment was real, the diversions were documented, and the men who carried stolen American weapons into combat against a common enemy knew exactly what they had done and why they had done it. They were soldiers first, allies second, thieves by necessity, and they won their war within the war, even as both nations lost the larger conflict that brought them together. The rogue allies of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment wrote a chapter of military history that neither army wants to remember. But history remembers anyway, in fragments and files and the fading memories of men who kept secrets for half a century before finally, reluctantly, beginning to speak. What they said changes everything we thought we knew about who fought beside us in Vietnam. And what they still refuse to say suggests that the full truth remains even more disturbing than anything yet revealed.